the evidence which we think has been gathering probably for the last kind of 15 years or so now, we really know that violence against women is pervasive, and about 1 in 3 women globally will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. There's lots of different forms of violence against women, obviously, all the way, we've got intimate partner violence, female genital cutting, early enforced marriage, sex selective abortion, but across all countries, generally speaking, intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence against women and girls, even in conflict settings. And while sexual violence in conflict is getting a huge amount of attention, and important indeed as it is, even within those settings, intimate partner violence is still one of the most common forms of violence. The interesting thing, and I think one of the first article really highlights that while we have this global number of 1 in 3 that I'm sure you've heard many times before, that there is great diversity across the globe. There's diversity by region in terms of the prevalence rates of violence against women and girls, but even within countries and even within communities, there is great diversity in terms of the prevalence of violence and the types of violence that are most common within those different settings. So it's really important to understand the specific nature of violence as it is happening in a particular context in order to be able to address it most effectively. What we've seen, and what I think the evidence has shown over the last few years in particular, is that the drivers of violence cut across levels of society. So we have factors that influence violence from an individual perspective, so an individual woman or man's personal history, their experiences as a child, their education. But then there's factors at the family and community level around socialization, norms about what is acceptable, norms around gender and masculinity, and factors at a societal level as well that really contribute to violence against women, whether that's legislative frameworks, gender equality or gender inequality, and patterns of women's economic empowerment, for example, that contribute, and that all of these factors intersect in a very complex way to contribute to patterns of violence around the world. And even more so now, we're starting to understand that the picture is perhaps even more complex, and that factors that operate at a global level, patterns of globalization, migration, urbanization, patterns around changing natures of religious practice are also influencing women's experiences of violence all the way down to the personal and the intimate partner level. The evidence, I think, is starting to point towards a number of practices that are really promising in terms of what's working to prevent violence against women and girls. And we see the things that are most effective really relate to having this comprehensive, multi-sectoral, multi-component approach that addresses the root causes of violence. So some examples of programs that have been effective or seem to be effective or promising: we see community mobilization programs that really engage the whole of community in long-term transformative change. We see whole of school approaches, again, that tackle the whole organizational culture of a school to create safe environments and promote gender equality. We see programs, for example, around economic empowerment, but particularly when they're sort of coupled with gender transformative and human rights based work. Parenting programs are starting to look promising when we're sort of talking about the gendered nature of raising children, looking at positive parenting practices, non-violent parenting practices, and that's looking promising as well. So there's a number of areas that I think we're starting to see real promise in. So engaging men and boys has become a bit of a kind of hot programming strategy, I guess, around the work on violence against women and girls. But I think what the latest evidence shows, and you can see it in the article by Jukes, Lang and Flood, is that really what's most effective is not just engaging men and boys as a sort of separate target group, but that all programming needs to look at a holistic process of transforming gender relations and gender norms. And that involves engaging men and boys and women and girls and communities and societies as a whole. So when you think about, for example, working at a workplace, it's not just about training individual men or women about violence against women, it's about transforming organisational structures and policies at the same time. When we talk about work in schools, it's not just about school curriculum, but it's about trying to transform school culture and create healthy, respectful relationships, cultures that promote a safe environment for children, and that working with teachers and parents across the whole school organisation and culture. The key elements, I think, that we see of successful programming is, one, that they're long-term, two, that they tend to have multi-components coming together to address those root causes of violence in a kind of systematic and integrated way. Programs that are not just about information or knowledge sharing, but that are about skills building in particular, and programs that really take, I guess, this gender transformational approach. So they're really trying to transform gender relations rather than just, for example, change attitudes. And we see that work around social norms is becoming really important in this field. So when we are trying to understand violence against women and have this sort of socio-ecological approach, you often see research, and one of the articles looks at the particular risk factors or the factors that increase the likelihood of an individual woman experiencing violence or an individual man perpetrating violence. And those individual factors often is what is targeted in programming. And we see that some of those key factors coming out relate to, for example, men's dominance and control over women. We see childhood factors being really important. So children who have experienced or witnessed abuse are more likely to end up in violent relationships, for example, later in life. We see factors that are very strong related to gender norms, gender equality, and notions of masculinity that are related to sexual entitlement and dominance and control over women. And then other factors which are seen, I think, to be triggers, not necessarily root causes, but factors that perhaps exacerbate the frequency or severity of violence, such as alcohol abuse, depression, lower socioeconomic status, and other factors such as that. And that's at the individual level. But then the other question that we sort of have to ask is, why is there such variation across countries in terms of the prevalence rates of violence? And there we sort of have to look at what's called an ecological analysis. And Laurie Heiser's article in the reading pack is really a sort of a bit of a breakthrough, I think, in trying to understand why we have different prevalence rates at a population level. And what sort of comes out really strongly there is that at that country level, some of the really key factors are about women's rights, women's access to land, to other productive resources, as well as the norms within society around the acceptability of violence, and gender inequality as a whole. So sometimes the factors that operate at the individual level can be different to how they operate at the population level. And programming, we often focus at the individual level, but we also need to start thinking about these structural level changes that really drive population level prevalence of violence against women and girls. I think that violence against women and girls really is on the international agenda in a way that it has never been before. And we can see that reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals recently passed, which include the goal on gender equality, but within that a number of targets specifically looking at the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls. There's also a target on the elimination of violence against children and other harmful traditional practices. And even when we look more deeply, a number of the other goals or the targets within the Sustainable Development Agenda for the next sort of 15 years have a number of other factors that really, in a way, can't be achieved unless we address violence against women as well. So even when we're looking at poverty, good health and well-being, quality education and access, economic empowerment, we know that violence against women and girls affects all of those things in a fundamental way. We know that it has long-term health consequences. We know that it reduces girls' access to education. We know even that violence against women and girls often occurs when women and girls are accessing basic resources like water and sanitation. And so I think what's coming out of the sort of the post-MDG agenda now is that really we need to take a much more holistic approach to addressing violence against women and integrate this work not just into gender equality work, but into other areas around poverty reduction, governance, economic empowerment as well. And that if the SDG agenda, I think in a way creates that framework where violence against women can be integrated into a much more sort of a comprehensive development agenda.